Pretty exciting, starting our 24th here. It's March 4th, of course. Well, was working. Helps me up, I suppose. Okay. As human beings, of course, we live by concepts, ideas, thoughts, and by the values that we construct out of these things and the words that we attach to them. We're also an intensely social species. That's why we get together like this. We form relationships, communities, societies, nations, and civilizations. It's a vital part of our existence to create these units of social organization at all these levels. That is recognized by the First Amendment, right alongside state-church separation, religious liberty, freedom of expression, and the right to petition the government. So we forget, there's this in the First Amendment too. So you're not just here today exercising your religious liberty, but also your right to peaceably assemble. And we peaceably assemble or associate with each other for a large variety of reasons. We use different terms to refer to why we do that or on what scale. So, for example, a couple form and maintain a relationship for very personal and intimate reasons that we talked a bit about last month when we talked about love and the love experience. And then, of course, from these come families that have a basis in kinship, and communities that share geographic and proximity relations. We had a service on neighbors and what it means to be a neighbor, not in the biblical sense, which is totally, if everybody's your neighbor, then nobody's your neighbor, right? And while societies and nations have their basis in ethnicity, history, languages, and other commonalities and so forth, all these other groups are based on other things. So there are two great categories of social organization based on our efforts to make sense of existence, and both of them cut across all these other units of social organization. One is science, the challenge and the effort of making sense of objective reality, which is to say of human experience that is the same for everybody, independent of whose experience it is. Science, of course, is now a global undertaking, an enormous cooperative project of understanding objective reality and learning to exploit that understanding to improve the conditions of our existence. So science comes to mean science and technology, not just what we know, but the things we can do with what we know. So it's a great process of trial and error, part of which is everyone involved in it having an interest in thinking of new and better ways to gather facts, organize those facts, and especially to improve our understanding by showing how and why some of it may be wrong or not quite right. But it turns out that objective reality, while vitally important, is in a way it's really only a small part of what we experience, at least as important, if not really a greater part of reality as we really experience it every day, is the subjective world of our feelings, our hopes, our fears, our aspirations, our attitudes, motivations, goals, and our highest and lowest emotional states. Some people just lump that all together and call it spirituality, but I think it's bigger even than that. Of course, all these can be linked to neurological, biological, biochemical things going on in our brains, of course, but those are not the same as the lived experiences that depend vitally on just whose experiences they are. You know, the molecule of serotonin in your brain is the same as the molecule in her brain, but they feel differently what they're doing in your brain. So this is really a daunting project to try to figure it out objectively, because people cannot share their subjective experience, their subjective sense of themselves. They have a much more difficult time, especially of showing how and why some of it may be wrong. How often do we go through life thinking, well, yeah, I feel down, and it's because of this person in my life making me miserable. How often do we stop and say, whoa, how do I know that? Could be wrong. Or even ask how it maybe is not quite right. And yet that's the essence of progress, that process of trial and error that is so important that we've come to recognize in science. And people get bogged down in these things, like confirmation bias, and they're not very willing to acknowledge their mistakes, learn from their mistakes, and replace their mistakes where they're not quite right ideas with better ones. That's been a real lack in religion, and that has to change, and that's one of the reasons we're here to change it. So church is this term for associations of people who share a religious stance and opinions. It's not a term that's reserved only for people whose way of making sense of the subjective human condition is a superstitious one. Although many superstitious people clearly like to exclude skeptics and naturalists as much as possible, there are Christians even that say that Islam is not a religion. It's a political system and so on and so forth. Well, this is the game of trying to exclude and marginalize others. It's the same thing as when, for example, homophobic people say that marriage is between a man and a woman. What's the purpose of that? So look for this trick. You'll see it all the time when part claims to be a whole. You'll see it all over. And this is how people try to set their own beliefs, their own attitudes, and their own values to be the default, to be the real thing. And we should guard against doing this ourselves because in many ways, we're more like believers than unlike them. The bottom line is this: everyone has a religion, quote unquote, has a religion for whom the subjective side of experience specifically and the human condition generally means something. And their satisfaction and joy in being connected to others who share a similar sense of what that meaning is, just as our connections to others in other ways are rewarding to us, because we're social animals, we're not sea turtles and with a solitary existence. So our religion of Freethought, that's the how and why of the North Texas Church. Freethought is a church. We're just doing what the other churches in town are doing, allowing for our size and our limited resources, but we're doing it with one less deity. Indeed, with no deities or other supernaturalisms, except at times we do talk about them as thought experiments. Some of these things that's how we think about them, they're thought experiments. So we're going to have a great presentation by our guest speakers, Rex Burks and Owen Younger today. We'll get them in just a few minutes. I'm hoping that we're going to learn a lot about their experiences, including maybe how they've learned from their own mistakes and interacting with believers so we can do better at that ourselves. And I'm sure that's where they're coming from. In particular, let's listen to what they've learned about the emotional content of what people believe about the Bible and such matters, because as we know, someone convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. How many heard that? Nice little saying. Cold facts and reason are great, but they're just not enough sometimes. Sometimes facts and reasons are most powerful when they underpin a psychological or emotional or spiritual message, as we often talk about at our services, and so more about that in a few moments. March 4th, I've got something out of order here. I'm missing a slide. Well, got a few things on March 4th. March 4th was the day in 1493 when explorer Christopher Columbus arrived back in Lisbon, Portugal, aboard his ship, the Nina, from his voyage to what is now the Bahamas and other islands in the Caribbean. Now, he was not the first European to reach the Americas, but certainly his voyages had the greatest impact on the world as we know it today. Also on March 4th, but later, in 1519, Hernan Cortez arrived in Mexico in search of the Aztec civilization and its wealth. And it's often styled that, oh yeah, he and his Spanish buddies just went in and took over. It turns out, the Aztecs were not very nice to a lot of the surrounding peoples, and they helped them out. They wanted to see the Aztecs. March 4th, 1628, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was granted its royal charter. March 4th, 1681, King Charles II grants a land charter to a guy named William Penn for what is now the state of Pennsylvania. March 4th, 1789, the first Congress of the United States met in New York City and put the U.S. Constitution into effect, and the United States Bill of Rights was then written and proposed to Congress. 5 years later, on March 4th, 1794, Constitution, number 5 years ago, Constitution, Bill of Rights, got in there. 5 years later, the 11th Amendment, the U.S. Constitution was passed by the U.S. Congress. You know the 11th Amendment, right? You know what that is? That's the one that established the sovereign immunity of the states. The states cannot be sued by their own citizens or the citizens of other states or other countries, not unless the state agrees to it. Sovereign immunity is a sweet deal. The courts have found that Puerto Rico also enjoys sovereign immunity, but not the territories of Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Northern Mariana Islands. And your infinite wisdom, Rex knows all that. You knew what the 11th Amendment was. I did. March 4th, 1933, Frances Perkins became U.S. Secretary of Labor, the first woman appointed to a cabinet-level position in the United States, and the longest serving in that position of Secretary of Labor. Graduated from Mount Holyoke, just like Perkins did. Perkins majored in chemistry and physics. Mount Holyoke College is one of the Ivy League, what they call Seven Sisters, located in South Hadley, Massachusetts. So you already got the preview of what I'm going to tell you next, and that's it's National Grammar Day today. As you go about the rest of your day, make sure you're going to correct everything in grammar. Is it wrong to end a sentence with a preposition? Where did that come from? Or as Churchill is supposed to have said, quote, "This is the sort of nonsense up with which I will not put." By the way, I did research this for you, all the footwork, all the framework I do for you. This idea comes from the Latin. There were people that were trying to make English more like Latin, and in Latin it's impossible to end the sentence with a preposition. Who here has a birthday this month? March has got to be important for some of us. Well, we have.
Well, mine.
There you go. Yours is in March? March.
March of 1973, the same as the north side of the moon.
March 19th.
March 19th, 1973.
Cool, very nice, okay. So, this church does not have dogmas and doctrines. There's no beliefs that you have to take on faith. There's no doctrinal statements that you have to sign or agree to, or we will shun you. On the contrary, we say, you must have doubt. I will shun you if you don't have doubts. Just kidding. But this is what we have for now, a brief expression of what we aspire to. Let us know what you think of it. I think we've got it boiled down pretty well. We have a lengthier statement. We certainly, I think, is an improvement on the humanist statement of principles. It's page long, nobody's going to even read that. Well, the most effort is put into our monthly service, but we have other things going on every month. We have game night every Friday at IHOP over off of Northwest Highway in Dallas. We have our non-first Sundays of the month, so next Sunday and last Sunday we have our salon. And all of the information on this is in today's bulletin. If you lose your bulletin, it's also available online. Of course, this month's bulletin is not up there quite yet, but this month's bulletin is back there. Did you all get one? This was a difficult, the article that I wrote for this, I didn't need to make it on gun control, but more on the shooting in Florida, because that came up after I'd already written a different article. And I just thought, churches care about people being shot to death and this crazy stuff, and really care about it, not like other churches where, oh, they're in a better place now. Oh, great, let's just all go on and get shot so you go to a better place. So I tried to, I was worried that somebody would think, oh, this is pro-gun rights or anti-gun rights, and so I showed them a couple of different people, and I got conflicting, so maybe I got it about right, but I meant to focus on what's going on in the brains of people like this guy that murdered all those kids in Florida. And we have to pay attention to that too. It's just like global warming. Just because you talk about remediation doesn't mean you shouldn't care about carbon dioxide levels and carbon dioxide production, but sea levels are rising, and so there needs to be some thought given to that, because that's going to happen whether you like it or not at this point. Anyways, we can always do more in our church, but it takes people to come up with ideas. It's not an automatic thing. You can't think like a lot of Americans do, that just, systems will just take care of everything. So how about you? No pressure, but we always need help for what we're already doing, especially the services. We're always open to doing more, even one-off or one-time events. If you have an idea, let's put that into practice. Use your imagination, put your free thinking into action. And of course, no one makes money from our church other than the hotel and the people that we buy stuff from. Owen and Rex are here talking for free because it's a labor of love for them.
Oh, we'll pass the point.
We will have the rainbow colored box, but that's to pay the bills we have. But the big payoff, I think, with our church is that really the genuine satisfaction that comes from participating in this little tiny step forwards into a future without supernaturalism. So Kent and Merlin are on hand for the Child Care Sunday School. I guess they didn't have any small kids that needed watching, so they're off the hook again for another month. We always need to have people in reserve ready to do that. We need and welcome the help of others, and that many hands make short work. Our next service is April 1st, and that just also happens to be Easter. Who knew that Christianity was so astrological? It's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox, which, by the way, the spring equinox, in case you're interested, happens on March 20th at 11:15 in the morning, our Central Time. And of course, April 1st, also the national holiday of fools, jokes, and humor. How appropriate, April Fools, Easter. So we're going to take advantage of that, and we'll have the third installment of John Goche's Logical Fallacies, and we have a moment of science, and who knows what else. You will have a good time in some laughs. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest speakers, Rex Burks and Owen Younger. Rex has been to our church services twice, I think, right?
This is the second.
This is the second time. He's an attorney. Owen is an airline pilot. He was just saying he does private flying currently. Did you work for an airline? Okay. So both, though, were once fundamentalist Christians until facts and reason had their way with them. Some of us have been down that road, and like Ken and Teller, you'll see one scholar. They both talk. They're going to share with us their experience interacting with a variety of Christian believers. Have they been successful in persuading many believers that theology is, as Penn Jillette and George Carlin would say, bullshit? Well, let's find out. And you have another PowerPoint.
Yeah, switch to our day.
And then that's a little forward and also slide.
Were any of you at Sam Harris last night in Dallas?
What?
So we were there. That was an interesting talk. It's funny, he talked about April 1st this year is Easter, and if you're familiar with the gospel account, Jesus is asked to provide a sign that he's the Messiah. And his first answer is that a wicked and deceitful generation seeks a sign, so he doesn't really answer the question. But he says, the only sign you're going to get is the sign of Jonah the prophet, right? That just as he was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the grave, right? So help me out with this. From Friday afternoon to Sunday morning, how do you get 3 days and 3 nights, right? Like the only sign he was ever going to give, you didn't get. Sorry about that.
So, is my voice adequately conveyed through the microphone? Good, good. This sounds like a joke. Did you hear the one about the two atheists that went to Sunday school and didn't get thrown out?
Yeah, sometimes it is.
So, sometimes, but it's always interesting. So first things first, I'm Owen, and he's Rex.
I guess we're staying on the side.
As the slide sort of gives away, I'm the really good-looking one, and Rex is tall.
I'm the tall one.
And I'm the one with aviator shades on, because airplanes. There are no airplanes in this presentation. I tried very hard to get some airplanes in here, but we didn't have space.
Right, so we thought we would talk a little bit about our own deconversion stories. Owen and I were both fundamentalist Christians for a long time, and in my case, I started out as a member of the Worldwide Church of God. Herbert Armstrong, Garner Ted Armstrong. Do any of you remember these guys? Yeah, so they were everywhere in the media, particularly 60s, 70s, into the 80s. And we were God's one true church, full stop. That's how we described the Worldwide Church of God. And every other church, including all the ones that you were members of, the Lutherans and the Methodists and the Baptists and the Catholics and the Mormons, all the other churches were Satan's counterfeits of God's one true church. So this was not a very ecumenical position, but there it was. And we were literal believers in the Bible. I mean, every word of the Bible was literally true. We kept not only the New Testament stuff, so we believed that Jesus died for our sins and was going to return and establish his kingdom, but we also kept all the Old Testament stuff. So we kept kosher, we kept sundown to sundown, Saturday Sabbath, we tithed, we didn't believe in heaven and hell. We believed in a future resurrection where the dead would rise and live in a kingdom. And so this was very Bible-based belief. Owen, you can click on it. I even went to college as the church's college. And so for us, religion was entirely the exercise of asking, what does the Bible say? And then we're going to do it. So Herbert Armstrong always said, go back to your Bible, go back to your Bible, go back to your Bible. And then his predecessor, when he died in 1986, Joseph Tkach took over as the pastor general of the church. And in my college years, so this would have been 1994, Joe Tkach stood in front of the entire faculty, student body, staff of a master college, so probably 2,000 people. And he says, guess what, guys? We had it all wrong. There's a new covenant that replaces this old covenant. We don't have to do all this Jewish stuff anymore. We're not the only true church. He basically dismantled the cult in one sermon. And so here I am, 22 years old, and everything I've ever believed was sort of taken out from under me. And for about 5 years, I just didn't do anything. I finished college, I moved over here and started grad school and started my career, and I wasn't really thinking about religion much. And then in about 2000, I was on the internet searching for a church to join, and I stumbled across Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine asked this question that I had never asked, which is basically, where did this Bible come from, right? So in the Age of Reason, he basically proposes that the Bible was man-made, right? Not all true, not all false, but just a human artifact. And if you think about the way that religion was for me, which was always based on the truth of the Bible, this was a second earthquake in my life. And I say, you know, I was probably an atheist by page 3 of the Age of Reason, because to ask the question and to acknowledge that the Bible was just written by people, it basically ripped the rug out from under any basis for belief that I had ever had.
Okay, so Rex and I became atheists at slightly different times in our lives, but we're about a week and a half apart in age. I have a similar but not identical story. I was a member of a fundamentalist congregation, the Church of Christ. Any former Church of Christ people in here? No, okay. Sometimes I can tell a really funny joke. I have former Church of Christ people in here, but if you weren't Church of Christ, it probably would be funny.
Just laugh anyway. There you go.
Right.
Serves the purpose.
Right. So I was the kid in the back of class in high school who would take my Bible. I was the nerdy dude that when he was done with his homework, I would read the Bible. I was in the chess club, I was on the debate team, and I did the church mission trip to Mexico, self-funded, you know, the whole thing. But there were some interesting dynamics at work in the mind of an otherwise thinking young man. My mother was Church of Christ, and my father was Southern Baptist. And the fact that those were two different things, it was this sort of cognitive dissonance point in my little pre-teenage brain. And I always wondered. And when we would go to a Southern Baptist church with my father's parents, there would be piano music and organ music. And when I would go to the Church of Christ, if anybody familiar with the Church of Christ, are the people that don't have instrumental music? Okay. All right. So I would go to the Church of Christ and sing praise to the Lord with the bass of our own voice, right? It's a big Church of Christ thing. We don't have instrumental music. And there's one obscure Bible verse that talks about that. And so the Church of Christers have decided that if you have instrumental music, and I'm not kidding, your praise is in vain. God's not listening if you have instrumental music.
Which is true, in fact.
Okay, but it's true for a reason that the Church of Christ people don't really get. Right. So, I don't want to give it away, but they're still gone. They're all made up. If it's possible to do it wrong, and that's the dichotomy, right? That's the conflict that I have now as a 10-year-old kid. And if it's possible to do it wrong, how do I know that I'm doing it right? And that became a very central set of questions in the mind of a sort of a growing young man. And I was very scientifically minded my entire life. I read all of the science books I could, and I almost majored in physics in college, but did political science instead because math. See, I got laughed. When we made this presentation in Houston, lots of rocket scientists there, and I said that, and nobody laughed.
When you laugh, he gets a little dopamine.
Right. It makes me feel taller when people laugh. So I got to high school, and here I'm reading all of the science I can find, and I'm thinking through all these problems, and I find myself joining the debate team. And turns out I was reasonably good at it.
No, you aren't.
No, I wasn't.
I'm just going to be.
Right. And so, actually, I really was. But now I'm learning how to sort of think critically and consider things logically and think deeply, and I'm reading more philosophy. And it occurred to me at some point that I could no longer really sustain the faith claims that were coming from my religious indoctrination.
Oh, and didn't you tell me one time that it was actually trying to justify religion and digging in deep that actually pushed you away?
It is. I got to just about my last year of high school, and I'd been spending, because I was doing public speaking and going on the church mission trip, and I was kind of a quasi leader in the youth group, and my church had been sort of grooming me. Everybody, my family, everybody expected me to go to Abilene Christian University and get the book of Bible and kind of be in the clergy. I had very, very different plans, but I didn't know it yet.
You look good in a robe.
And my church Christ people don't wear robes.
Oh.
Yeah, I could look, by the way, very much like a Church of Christ preacher, except words are different here. Right, but in trying to justify my faith, right, in critically analyzing what it was I believed, and holding my faith up to a burden of proof, and asking very critical questions about it, it was that, in fact, that pushed me further and further away from the faith. And it is, as we sort of tie a bow around that sort of the intro story, I've just given you the 5-minute version of my deconversion.
So this is what we both ultimately faced, which is, where is your commitment? Is your commitment to Christianity, which is what I would have told you for the first 27 years of my life, or is your commitment to truth, which is the decision I ultimately made? And the emphasis here is that, yes, we were really believers. Owen and I both really, really believed this. And the reason this is important is if you're going to go to a church and tell people you're atheist, the first thing they say is, you were never a real Christian. And so we tell our stories to say, look, I really believed it all. And no, we weren't mad at God. In fact, I was actually looking for a church when I stumbled upon Thomas Paine. So, and Owen was looking to double down and justify his faith when he found the evidence that took him away from it.
This is important. My dog didn't die, my mother didn't die, nobody died from cancer, right? There was nothing awful or horrible that happened in my life.
It was truth.
Right, it was a commitment to truth and critical thinking and skepticism. Notice skeptical text, because that's us, that's right.
So a funny thing happened, if you want to click on, when, for myself, when I came to not believe anymore, I found the Bible so much more interesting than I ever had as a believer. And as a believer, we always read the Bible as if it was this one statement and it all agreed with each other. But as a non-believer, I was able to let the Gospels have a different voice from one another and from Paul, and I was able to learn about the different communities in the early church that created these different documents and let them speak with different voices. I have Dr. Bart Ehrman's picture on here because he's probably the voice that's been the loudest in both of our heads, but certainly his writings and all of the things from the Jesus Seminar, West Star Institute, Burton Mack, so many of these scholars that have really illuminated the history of this book we call the Bible. And so when I became an atheist in 2000, I spent the next decade just devouring all of this literature that I could, far more interested than I ever was as a believer.
About 15 years ago, I discovered Bart Ehrman, and I can't remember now. I think I was on Amazon.com, and it came up as a recommendation. And the first book I read wasn't Misquoting Jesus, it was, I don't remember. But the second one I read was Misquoting Jesus, and I was hooked. And at that point, I read everything he had ever written, and when he comes out with new books, I always read them. I find his analysis to be extremely persuasive and very cogent. And then, so this presentation was actually originally built to present to a church group last year, and we talk about this particular slide, and I'll explain why it's here. People ask us, okay, I've got it, you're an atheist, why in the world are you here in a Sunday school class? And the answer is to look at and understand Western civilization. The United States and Western civilization, sort of in a bigger picture, you really have to understand one of the most important influences on Western civilization, certainly for the last 2,000 years. And I defy you to find me something that has been more influential.
For good or bad.
For good or bad.
Than the New Testament.
Right, than the New Testament of the Christian Bible. And I insist that it's very difficult to find anything that's been more influential than the New Testament. And so as an academic and an intellectual exercise, taking the time to understand it, and in particular, to understand what it means to different groups of people who claim the label Christian, is something that can inform our public discourse. Rex and I tend to be relatively progressive. If you're not, if you're an atheist and sort of in the libertarian bent, or you're more conservative, that's great, that's fine. But even from that perspective, right, to engage in the public conversation, understanding the entire tapestry of people who claim the title Christian and see where they're coming from and what it means to them, turns out is pretty fascinating. So that brings us to the project.
When Owen and I met, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years ago, we met at a Dallas Plano Atheist dinner meetup and sat across the table from each other, and we started comparing notes about our own deconversion and our own interest in the Bible. And I described to Owen that I had been spent some of that 18 years sort of immersed in progressive Christianity and the very liberal groups of Christians that have sort of swept away some of the myth and miracle but still like to play church. And I said, I've met Christians who don't care about the afterlife, don't believe in the afterlife.
And I said, dude, you're full of poo-poo.
Yeah, he thought I was making this up. Because coming from a fundamentalist point of view, right, the afterlife is the big ticket item. It's why everyone's there. And I said, well, why don't we just go? Why don't we go to a church and visit a Sunday school, and I'll show you these people. And so we at random picked a Presbyterian church, picked a Sunday school class, showed up with our wives, and that very day, we identified ourselves as atheists. I asked if there were any Christians there that didn't believe in the afterlife, and we got hands the very first time. And I said, so there's a lot that we don't know about the breadth of Christian denominations. Let's go do this some more.
When I left the Church of Christ as a late teenager, it was a multi-year process from getting to the point where I could claim to be no longer a Christian and eventually claim to be an atheist. But when I finally left that, I didn't go back and look. This was pre-internet. I didn't go back and look for atheist groups. I didn't have access. I didn't have resources. And I didn't have any interest. I let my very fundamentalist faith go, and I didn't spend any time searching for anything to replace it. I was just going to be a happy atheist. And in college, I met very few other atheists, but a couple, and was happy to know that I wasn't all by myself in the world. But I never bothered looking at the entire spectrum. And Rex pointed out to me when we met about 5 years ago, very early in the conversations we had initially, I realized that I had gaps in my knowledge. I had gaps in my Christian experience. The only Christian experience I had was this very narrow experience from a very fundamentalist denomination. Ironically, they would call themselves non-denominational. But that's all I knew. And a little bit of Southern Baptist thrown in, and I knew I didn't believe any of that junk, and was done with it. And that brings us to the next step. We wanted to talk to people.
Right, so we actually chose to go to Sunday school classes, and we did this for several years. In fact, we're still doing it. 2 weeks ago, we were at a Methodist church. We chose the Sunday school classes because unlike the main service, where you just sit and listen to a sermon, the Sunday school classes are interactive. This is where you can really talk to the believers and ask them what they believe and sort of dig into the belief. So that's why we focused on Sunday school classes. And we also look for an explicit invitation. Everyone's welcome. They'll put this on the website, or they'll put this on the sign up front. We never wanted to be wedding crashers that would just show up unwelcome. And so we always look for an explicit invitation.
And because Rex is an attorney, and he's really doubly do right. In good ways, in really good ways. Like the first half dozen times that we did this at different denominations, he would actually print the page and take it with us as a kind of a flame retardant, right? In case we ever got into an altercation.
Why are you here, young man?
Right.
Well, you invited us. Well, they never asked me.
But that's actually very interesting. So we got to talk about the goal in the Sunday school class was, the thing that Rex and I are interested in is that the scholarship around the Bible and how people see and understand that, and how that informs their lives, right? How they live.
Yeah, so if you look at the church websites for any of these churches, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, Assembly of God, all of these churches, they'll have these adult Sunday school classes that are the young single people, the young married people, the older people with kids, the senior citizens, the silver singles, it'll be these demographic classes, and we'll skip all that stuff. We're looking for the class that's about Bible study, and usually in these churches you can find one class that's like, we study the Bible. Great, there's our people. And so we always wanted also to have the everyman experience. We wanted to have the experience that anyone walking off the street would have when visiting this church. So what we specifically didn't do is call ahead to the pastor and say, we're atheists and we want to visit your church. We didn't want that. We wanted to just show up and have the experience that anyone would have showing up.
Nothing scripted, right?
Right.
Crowd rules. When we started doing this, and these have evolved just a little bit, but when we started doing this, we made this agreement. Every once in a while, our wives will come with us, but primarily this is just Rex and Owen going to different Sunday school classes. We're the good guys.
What Owen means is exactly twice our wives have come with us.
Okay, right. We're the good guys. This is not why we're doing this, but most of the time, we are meeting people who have never actually encountered a person who is totally unashamed to say, I'm an atheist, I do not believe your mythology is real. And we want to model good, proper, respectful behavior. So we dress just like this.
We wear suits, we carry Bibles. Sometimes we're the only ones with a Bible.
Yeah, sometimes we're the only ones with a Bible.
The atheists bring their Bible.
We are. You want to carry on?
Yeah, respectful, courteous. I mean, we fully engage. I know you can't imagine us talking, but we do. We always tell the truth. That's our most important rule. We don't ever want to leave the impression that we're something we're not. We've sought out variety, both denominational variety and demographic variety. So the denominational variety, we're going to show you this in a minute, but we found the spectrum of belief to run from, the most conservative, fundamentalist, literal myth and miracle, and we're talking Assembly of God, Pentecostal, Seventh-day Adventists, some Lutherans, all the way to the very liberal end, Christian in name only, Episcopalians and Presbyterians. And I would put Methodists probably smack in the middle of that spectrum, which you'll see in a minute. But we sought that variety. But we also wanted to always explicitly identify ourselves as atheists.
With the A word.
With the A word. And so the way we handle that is most of these classes are about an hour. Right? So about 20 minutes in to the class, one of us, sometimes Owen, sometimes myself, will say, whatever the scripture is we're talking about, it's always Paul. They'll be talking about Romans, and we'll say, well, as an atheist, I think this scripture, blah, 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 blah. And I want to be 3 sentences beyond the word atheist, right, before the room is like, oh, we've got an atheist in there. But the thing is, once you do that, and you've sort of normalized it and moved on, they've got 40 minutes left to sit there, and they're experiencing the cognitive dissonance that they've already learned to like you. Here we showed up, we're talking the Bible, we're reading the Bible, we know our Bibles, and now they know we're atheists, and they have 40 minutes now to deal with that. But it really sort of opens up the conversation, because then we can ask anything we want, and they're going to have to answer us, or otherwise they're not sharing their faith.
What we're not doing.
We're not shouting.
Right, we're not yelling at each other. We are not trying to deconvert anybody. We're not trying to go to a place of worship and talk people out of their worship. If you want to do that, great, I'm good. We are not trying to have a debate with anybody. We are trying to learn what the Bible means to that constituency and take a better understanding away from that. And this is actually something that, it's a subtle distinction, but with a lot of the new atheists, and Hitch had a problem with this, we've got a slide about it, that there a lot of atheists who don't have the background that Rex and I do, in particular, that don't have the broad sort of exposure to the entire tapestry of Christianity, really have a blind spot, and that affects how effective they are in their public discourse.
Before you click on out,
sure.
Go back a second. I want to talk about this subtle distinction for a second, because when we say we're not trying to deconvert at Sunday school, that's the key term here, because Owen and I are both pretty evangelical atheists. Like I would always walk through life trying to find someone who I can talk out of their religion. because I think they'd be better off without it. I think they'd be better off here with you. So I'm in the Sunday schools not doing that, but instead gathering intelligence that helps me go back to my daily life and go back to you and try to make us all better at doing that. So that's why I call it a subtle distinction. We do advocate evangelical atheism, but we're not doing that at Sunday school.
So expectations. We thought the first 4 or 5 times we did this, we actually talked about how we would respond if we were asked to leave. We talked about how we
I wanted to get dragged out.
how we would respond to altercations, things that we expected. The first and most interesting thing that I can say is, not only have we never been thrown out, we have never been asked to come back.
Every single time.
Every single time.
After we tell them we're atheists.
Universally, they always ask us to come back. And in fact, sometimes they ask us to come back and be the presenters for their Bible study.
Astonishing. In fact, this presentation was first developed for the big Methodist church downtown to their combined Sunday school classes. So, you never know.
And by the way, in June, like the second and
They're having us back for 2 weeks in a row.
2 weeks in a row to do a Bible study on Jesus and Paul and some of the early.
So if any of you want to come to the Methodist church, you can
Right.
Which Methodist?
First United downtown, the big one.
But where? Here.
Downtown Dallas.
Downtown Dallas. Yep, First United Methodist Church, Dallas. So we have never encountered anger. We have never, in really only one case at Park City's Baptist, can I think of a person who actually, well, and
I think the Seventh-day Adventist guy was trying to.
Yes, the SEO.
But it's been rare. It's been
It's
very
pretty rare. They like talking to us, and we find frequently in the after class sort of hallway discussions, they'll come up and they'll look around and I would never use the word atheism if you guys speak some really good
Right.
Right. It's fascinating. They've always asked us to come back in frequently.
Sometimes we do for a couple of weeks, but then we need to
Sometimes
move
we
on.
do. There are only so many Sundays, and we still, and we've been doing this, what, 2.5 years now, something like that? And there are so many more churches that we want to try and get to. But it's been fascinating. Why do we care? And I talked about this a little bit before, so I spoiled the slide some. We think that the world would be a better place if everybody was an atheist. If everybody adopted secular, humanist values, I think we would take much better care of each other. And I would say that the behaviors that Christians hold up as the model for proper action and behavior and treatment of others, I think that you can have those same kinds of outwardly empathetic behaviors, altruistic behaviors, without the dogma. And that if you take the dogma out of it, you have an even better model. But that's not what we're doing in Sunday school.
Okay, so why should these people care?
Okay, because I talk a lot. I never got to it. We care because knowing and understanding what people take away from the Bible helps you in your public conversation with them. If you advocate for anything, for Freethought or for anything else, you can be more effective in that advocacy. But more than that, you can understand where your counterparty is coming from, and it helps to reduce the sort of demonization of your opponents if you think of them that way. Hopefully we don't. And we think you should care as well. So Rex, why do you think they should care?
Well, click the slide, I'll tell you. I think that when the Christians talk to us about their beliefs, all of the claims that they make, Owen and I have distilled down to 5 claims. The first one is the supernatural, right? God is real, miracles are real. The second is that the Bible is a divine, perfect book. We've all heard that. The third is that God's plans are beautiful. This is more of a subjective claim. Christianity is very good for the world, and life without Christianity would be hopeless and meaningless. Christians tell us these things in various terms, and so we answer these questions honestly when we're talking to them. As to the supernatural, there's zero good evidence for God or miracles. As the Bible being a divine book, the Bible is obviously man-made. The plan is grotesque. Christianity is an obstacle to human flourishing, and a life of reason and free thought can be meaningful and beautiful. So these are the answers we give when the Christians make these claims. But, oh, you skipped one, sorry.
You still need this slide?
No.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so this is and the intellectual landscape oversimplified, so I'm acknowledging this is an oversimplification, but all people can sort of fall into believers and non-believers, and we're talking about theistic religion in this case. The non-believers, some of them are going to be advocates for non-belief. That's us, that's the evangelical atheists. Some of them are going to be non-advocates. And then the non-advocates fall into those who support the advocates. We'll call them the boosters, right? You may not be doing this kind of work, but you at least are in favor of it happening. There are those who are merely apathetic to advocacy and just go along with their life. They're probably not even sitting here. And then there are those that are actively opposed to advocacy. And we get this even from atheists who tell us, no, what you're doing is wrong, leave them alone. And so this is the group that we're trying to figure out the motivation, to sort of answer the question why you should care. And so here's our unscientific theories about the advocacy opponents. We hear these things from fellow atheists who tell us you shouldn't be doing this kind of work. You're preaching just like they're preaching. You can't change anyone's mind. I'm a good liberal and I practice tolerance. And then my theory on all of this is that we simply haven't convinced you on point number 4. Remember our point number 4? Christianity is an extreme obstacle to human flourishing. So it's more education about the harm that comes from Christianity that I think will overcome this tendency of some non-believers to say, leave them alone, don't try to change anyone's mind.
So, Christianity is not just false.
Do you know this movie, Jesus Camp?
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen this
Yeah.
film?
Yeah.
If you haven't seen this film, please go watch
Yeah.
this movie. 5 times.
And Jesus Camp is a great model for how bad Christianity is for the world. Rex and I have an entirely different presentation that focuses just on the 5 claims, and we delve into those with a lot of detail. Maybe sometime you guys would be interested in that. But we spend a lot of time on claim 4. We think that even the kindest, gentlest, nicest version of Christianity that you can imagine, the little old lady sitting in a country church somewhere where that lady would never hurt anybody, she believes things that are absolutely destructive and harmful, and she probably doesn't realize that she believes them or how bad they are for the world. This is venom in the minds of children, and sometimes you hear the new atheists talk about it, and atheists are criticized, and there's even a book, Why Are You Atheists So Angry? It's written by an atheist. I went through an angry atheist phase for a few years, and I know a lot of people who, shortly after they become an atheist, go through a 2 or 3 or 4 year phase where they're really very angry. And I think one of the reasons that anger is there is because we recognize how insidious the mind virus is, and how harmful it was, and how, frankly, well adapted it has become at persisting. Christianity is not just false. It is horribly harmful to the world and to the people who believe.
So when we talked about visiting churches to gather this intelligence about Christian denominational variety, this is really just one more tool in the toolbox, right? So someone like Richard Dawkins can teach us a lot of science. Someone like Bart Ehrman can teach us a lot of history. Someone like Bill Maher can reach people through humor. These are all different approaches to trying to change minds and to win people over. And we think that this knowledge of Christian denominational variety that we've been harvesting from these church visits is one more tool in that toolbox. Certainly we found it helpful. Know your audience.
So that brings us to the hitch slide.
What is he looking at there, by the way?
I have no idea, for the record, I have no idea.
No, but the point is that, because Christopher Hitchens, as articulate and beautiful person as I think he was, he did not grow up as a fundamentalist Christian of any kind. And so when he would talk to groups of Christians and debate Christians, and you can see hundreds of hours of this on the internet, he would often talk about things like, oh, it's so crazy you believe in a talking snake. And the truth is, there's a lot of Christians that don't believe the Genesis account is a literal story, right? It's a metaphor, they might say. So understanding that variety is, while we're saying it's a common blind spot, I think would help anyone that wants to advocate for free thought.
There are Christians who believe that we need Jesus because 2 naked people in a garden were persuaded by a talking snake to eat the wrong magical fruit.
You're saying that didn't happen?
No. But there was a time.
How do you know you weren't there?
There was a time in my life where I would have answered yes if someone had said, if you put a video recorder in the Garden of Eden watching that exchange, would you have seen a talking snake captured on the video recording? I said, you bet. I absolutely know in my heart that that's what happened. And I would have said yes. I would have believed it. And this is the thing, even within denominations, you find such divergence of belief.
In the same congregation.
In the same congregation at Park Cities Baptist Church, upstairs in the early class. Some of these mega churches don't just have early services and late services, they have early classes and late classes.
Which is great, because then we can double.
Right, we double dip on those Sundays.
More Sunday school.
Right. And it was fascinating. In the upstairs class, we had a guy say, if you don't believe that the Bible is literally true,
You cannot be a Christian and believe in evolution.
Right,
That's
right,
the point.
right. You cannot be a Christian believing in
1 hour later, 1 floor below,
on the same day.
the leader said, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, Genesis is clearly an
This is clearly
Same church.
metaphorical. Same church. It is remarkable how divergent it is. So if you're having a conversation, and you see the YouTube videos of Hitch talking about talking snakes, and the minute he does that, he loses some big portion of the audience who are Christians, but never would say that Genesis was anything other than metaphorical, right? The snake is a metaphor for evil or something, right? And if you try to have that conversation, you lose people. And this is one example of how understanding denominational variety, and not just denominational variety, but belief variety, right? We're using the term denomination to describe a spectrum, but even within denominations, there is a spectrum.
So what have we learned? Let's click on. The first thing we learned is that Christians are very welcoming. We were suspecting more hostility when we walked into Sunday school and told them we were atheists, and we have never encountered that. They have been very welcoming to us. And really, I think the takeaway here is these people are not our enemies. These people are our friends and family and neighbors. I don't want to hurt these people, ridicule these people, mock these people. I want to save these people. I want to free these people, just like I was freed from this. And so these are our friends, and if we treat them as such, we make a lot more progress.
And the more liberal the denominations are, the less welcoming
It's ironic.
they are. Like when we go, your quip about Episcopalians being Christians in name only is hilarious. When we go to the Episcopalian church, nobody walks up and introduces themselves. Nobody comes over to talk to us. Nobody comes and says, where are you visiting from? They always assume we're from out of town, right? And so when we go to the Southern Baptist churches and the Pentecostal churches, it's like radar. Hey, there's a new face. Let's go talk to those people.
The funniest one was that we showed up early for a Seventh-day Adventist church, and they're pretty casual in the way they dress, and Owen and I are dressed like we are today. And someone comes in who is a visitor to the church and assumes we're the clergy, and starts asking us about the service and what time it's going to. I should have just finished.
That was hilarious.
So we've talked about this spectrum, you know, the Pentecostals, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians. I'm not worried here about the liturgy or the, robes and candles versus drums and guitars. I'm talking about the fervor of the belief, right? How much myth and miracle is there? And there's less and less as you move down this spectrum. And it matches up nicely with the 5 claims we observe, right? So at the conservative end, you'll hear them talk about myth and miracle. You'll hear them talking about the inspiration of the Bible. At the more liberal end, they're not talking about that so much. They're talking about how it's good for the world and they have to do it because life would be meaningless without it. And so again and again, we find that as we move up and down this spectrum, the kinds of claims they make adjust as well. And it's not the same. There's no monolith. Who or what is God? The more conservatives will talk about God, and he sounds like Santa Claus on the throne in the sky. And the more liberals will talk about God, and it's just sort of a life force and a universal intelligence. It's much less personal, right? The authority of the Bible. The liberals. We had a leader in an Episcopalian church in large Sunday school class at Lent time, and he says, somebody asked him a question about Paul going off about the homosexuals in Romans. And he said, and he just sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, maybe Paul was wrong. And you never hear that in a Baptist church.
Can you imagine a Baptist ever saying that?
Moral absolutes, obviously the LGBT issue is burning in a lot of these churches. and they'll take different tacks on that. Whether they talk about miracles, whether they ever pray for miracles, listen to the prayers in different churches, and you'll hear at the conservative end, the prayer explicitly is asking for some kind of miraculous intervention in health or in world politics. You'll never hear that at the liberal end. It's always something much more amorphous and vague, and give us peace, something like that. Afterlife, the big ticket, we've already talked about that. For half of these Christians, it's the only thing that matters, and for the other half, it doesn't matter at all. And that's a strange dichotomy.
In the Wilshire Baptist Church, now Wilshire is Baptist in name only, right? If you're familiar with them, they're the ones that made a huge sort of splash in the Dallas religious community last year before last, I guess now.
Yeah, because they were
They announced
welcoming gay people.
Yeah, they're welcoming
even ordaining.
LBGT, and even saying we'll have clergy. It was a big deal. In that Bible study that Rex and I went to at Wilshire, one guy in class said, "I don't give a damn about the
It was
actual."
the church leader, and he said, "I don't give a rat's ass."
Right.
That was his technical term. And then they invited us to their club night. So we actually went and drank beer with the Baptists. True story.
I can't tell you,
Yes.
but this is a very fun.
Those Baptists. So progressive Christianity, how many of you are familiar with John Shelby Spong? Okay, so Spong has written 23, 24 books. Really, I think Spong wrote one book 23 times. But the idea is that he's got this version of Christianity that doesn't rely on any myth or miracle. And I call this the atheist dilemma because on the one hand, you want to shake him and say, come on, you don't really believe this stuff. But on the other hand, by doing that, he's helping pull people out of fundamentalism. And so I think it may be a little bit of an alliance with Freethought, the progressive Christians that we've met.
I think the world would be better if all fundamentalists became sort of liberal Christians. But to the point I made earlier, I think the world would be better if we could just shed the dogma and all become humanists. So I'm saying what Paul said.
So here's another interesting finding. I sort of alluded to this earlier. We're picking churches at random. We're picking Sunday school classes, not knowing anything about what they're studying. We're walking in cold, and over and over and over again, they're studying Paul, and more specifically, 1 Corinthians and Romans. And we're talking up and down the denominational spectrum. And when we first started this project, we guessed that it would be the Gospels, right? You'd figure that it would be the study of the life of Jesus, but no, it's always Paul. And this sort of lines up with what something Owen and I had always believed, which is that the religion we call Christianity is really the creation of Paul. I don't necessarily think Jesus thought he was starting a new religion, if it existed at all. And so it has been fascinating, and Owen and I should get a chuckle when we walk into these classes, and it's always Paul, always.
Romans or Corinthians.
Mm-hmm. Occasionally Galatians.
Occasionally. So, and Rex and I recently had a conversation with a group of Christians, and we made this observation, and the reply we got from Todd was, I don't understand why that's a problem. And I tried to explain to Todd, and seems like a really, really decent guy. So think about it like this. If you're a Christian, you believe that the incarnate being of the author of the entire universe actually came to earth and lived for a short lifetime and traveled and taught and had words and had teachings and
words in red even.
Right, all the stuff in red, right? And that those are the most profound moral instructions that humans have ever been given, okay? And you have your religion named in worship of that dude. But when you go study the Bible, you go study what another dude had to say about the first dude.
Who never met him.
And didn't quote him and didn't know anything about his teachings. So now we have this dichotomy, right? I could go actually study what Jesus did and said. And if you're a Christian, you believe the gospel. That's canon, right? You believe that's real. Like Jesus said, most Christians believe, who haven't studied the scholarship, believe Jesus actually said those things. But you don't study that. Instead, you study what this other fellow, Paul,
well, and even Paul didn't care. He never quotes Jesus. Okay, so let's move on. This is just a quick slide. We just find that Christians just don't know the Bible. They don't read it. They know a few verses. They can't tell you who wrote any of the books or when they were written or what the context was. They just don't know.
Knowledge of
and they're not getting this in church either.
Yeah.
Okay. So we Oh, yeah. I don't think we want to take time to tell this story, but basically we visited a Pentecostal church so we could hear speaking in tongues, and the lady stood up to speak in tongues, and the pastor told her to sit down and wait. And when he was done, then she got to do it. So he basically told the Holy Spirit to take it. That was pretty fun.
If you believe in the whole speaking in tongues thing, that's literally the voice of God being transmitted.
Owen and I very rarely stay for church. We go to Sunday school, but in the Pentecostal church we do because we like to see this theater.
It's a thing to see if you've never seen it.
Yeah, go to a Pentecostal church.
People ask us all the time, are you guys writing a book?
Yeah, the Christians ask us.
The Christians
they want
ask
to
us.
read it.
Yeah, the Christians ask us that. And we tell them all the time, you should do what we're doing. This is fascinating. We tell Christians all the time, you should go visit other churches because it's amazing the diversity of experience that you can have.
Right.
And maybe we were. Lots of doubt. Just below the surface, there are people that follow us out into the hallway. I would never use the word atheist, but you guys make a great point.
Well, and the thing is that once you tell them you're an atheist and you're standing there in church, you sort of become the confessor, right? They can tell you things that they haven't been able to tell anybody, and it is a lot of doubt. In conclusion, very quickly, we advocate for free thought because the world needs it. A great variety of Christian belief is a common blind spot. Engaging believers is the best way to understand them. We learn all we can so we can be better advocates. This is why we care, and we hope you do as well. Questions?
Please.
I know we're out of time, but if we have any quick questions, yes.
Catholics have Bible study?
No, and that's the problem. So we've been to Catholic Mass. So here's the thing with Catholic education, because we want to do this, but they either have the class you can join if you're trying to join the church, the rite of initiation, or they have education for the kids. But to find sort of Bible study class within the Catholic, but no, we haven't had that. We want to have that experience. I know some dioceses do that, but we haven't found it. We have been to the Mass and just talked to people, afterwards.
We actually have sort of
We've done a little bit of that.
we have connections trying to help us find some place where we can
Yeah.
go, but we're
So
trying
if
to.
any of you know of Catholic Bible studies, we'd love to go.
Yeah.
Anything else? Tom?
What geographical locality, out of curiosity?
Most of this has been Dallas.
Almost always Dallas.
Yeah.
DFW area.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, when you hit you guys ought to hit some of the rural areas. I'm
So-
curious to know,
Yeah.
the difference in level of.
Yeah, so Owen and I haven't done so much of that together, but I spent quite a bit of time at several in East Texas and got to know people, and you're absolutely right. The education level changes it, the rural versus urban changes it, black and white changes it, because there's a strong ethnic divide in most of these congregations. And there are differences for sure that you would put them in different places on the spectrum. And some denominations, like if you say Southern Baptist, you know what you're going to get. If you say Assembly of God, you know what you're going to get. But some of the denominations vary widely. Like a church called Methodist could be very conservative or very liberal, depending on what it is. Same thing with Lutheran. So a lot of times you can tell based on the name, and other times you can't.
There was another question right here.
Yes.
Did you ever go to Jehovah's Witness or Mormon congregation?
So I didn't talk about it much. I actually, for about a year in early childhood, my family was a Mormon family. Anyway, it was.
No, but we did find a Mormon church that is on our radar
Yeah.
very soon to do.
Yeah. But the answer is no. And Jehovah's Witnesses are very sort of selective about how you get into their services.
Yeah.
So that's
Some of those are a little harder enough to crack.
yeah. Did you have a question in the back?
Yeah, I was wondering if any of these groups that you've, any of these Bible studies that you've gone to, have you presented this outside of what we're recording here, for example, and had anyone hear you make those statements, how damaging Christianity is, and do they come back to you and say, you're using us, we've been had, they get angry?
No, not at all, because we've always told the truth. There's not, we tell the truth when we are visiting Sunday school classes, and the few that have asked us to present, we tell them the same thing you did. We never wanted to have any moment where we were saying one thing to the Christians and another thing to the non-believers.
So you actually have told them, we see Christianity is extremely damaging.
Yeah, yes. So you see in my slide, it says the plan of God is grotesque. That's exactly the slide that I used when we talked to the Methodists.
We used the word. We used that slide.
And I had some of them nodding and agreeing.
In the presentation, in the verbal presentation, we said the word grotesque, and nobody batted an eye. And I'm telling you, inside the Christian mind, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance, and as atheists, we talk about it. We even had an early conversation here about you believe that God is love, and you still believe that He drowned everybody on the earth. right? You take John 3:16, you divide it with the Old Testament, what do you get? For God so loved the world that he killed everybody with a flood, right?
But he felt bad about it after.
But he felt terrible about it,
Promised he wouldn't do it again.
promised to do it with fire next
That's a
time.
mistake.
Right.
Mistake.
So, that's the kind of cognitive dissonance that's there. Why would you need substitutionary human sacrifice in order to forgive sins? If I were the author of the universe, I could just say, you're forgiven. It's great, but that's not what we find. And Christians know that, right? Christians actually know and have those thoughts too, but maybe they never say them out loud. It's fascinating. When we are honest about that, I find that at least in the minds of the people who are, and they still ask us back, those same people that heard us sing grotesque asked us to come do a 2-part series on Jesus and Paul.
That's amazing.
In June. Yeah.
One of the things that happens is after we announce that we're atheists, then we try to mostly ask questions, right? And so I'll look at someone who just made some statement, and I'll say, what do you really believe about the afterlife, or the resurrection of Jesus, or the inspiration of the Bible, or whatever it is we're talking about? And invariably, the first answer is, well, the church teaches, no. I want to know what you believe. And often you get a different answer. And they're so accustomed to giving the corporate answer, but when you're looking them in the eye and you say, what do you really believe? It's often a much more doubtful answer, a much more agnostic answer. Well, I like to believe, or I choose to believe, or maybe, you don't find the certainty that you would find reading the church website. Another question? Yes.
Seems like you guys have a pretty good approach when you go into all these Sunday schools and get good feedback and stuff, but has anybody, as an individual, ever approached y'all afterwards with any type of opposition? Because I think that sometimes people in a group don't want to be that guy.
So I won't call it opposition, Wade.
Yeah, we've had probably a dozen people that have wanted more conversation after, and we'll meet them for coffee and talk for hours. We've done that with Baptists. We did that with one of the ministers at one of the Episcopalian churches, former Southern Baptist. And so we'll have as much follow-up conversation as they want. We always come with our business cards and offer them, email them, we'll meet you anytime. So yeah, there's been some of that, but not really opposition. If anything, it's not that they're trying to counter our non-belief, it's that they're uncomfortable having their belief challenged. And we try to do it in a very Socratic way, just asking questions, but even that just shuts people down.
Only one time at First United Methodist did one of the people in the class, a really, really young guy, say to us, why do you care? I get it, you're an atheist. And he, by the way, didn't even self-identify as a Christian. He's like, why do you care? So we had to sort of talk about why we think that the Bible is influential.
Yeah.
I've heard from more than one atheist used to be a believer that one of the big problems or difficulties is being told that you have a moral problem. So I'm thinking of one person in particular said that when they went to their minister and started asking them, what about this, and that just didn't add up in the Bible, the minister said, this is not a problem, you got a moral problem in your life. Are you cheating on your
Oh,
wife?
sure.
Something is going on.
Absolutely.
So the people are made to feel guilty for having any kind of doubt, and faith is a big virtue, and that's the whole thing, is that you're not supposed to have this stuff proven to you. And
Right.
Faith is this big act of devotional love.
Absolutely.
To God.
And this is a point we tried to make a couple of times. Like you asked the question, do we have people come and try to counter us? Occasionally, but 10 to 1, it's the people that want to confess their doubts, because there's no one's given them an outlet for that. And if you say, I used to be a Christian and now I'm not and I don't believe it anymore, they'll try to find a quiet moment to tell you what they, not to like shed their religion, but to tell you the things they have doubts about. Because the church isn't giving them any outlet for doing that. To Tim's point, they're shutting you down when you try to do that. Yes?
This morning, I find this was so apropos. There was a little advertisement in the Star Telegram that's the pulpit, and he lists all these ministers that have written books about their church that they no longer believe, and these are false things. It was Methodist, Baptist, Mormon, blah, blah, blah. Well, the only one left standing was Church of Christ. So it was you, it was Church of Christ.
That's funny. Yeah, there's actually a organization called the Clergy Project. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah.
So they have a roster, an anonymous roster of ministers who are still in the clergy now, who no longer believe but aren't leaving their jobs. And it's,
That's how they pay their bills.
there's far more than you would imagine. So that's a common problem.
Yes, sir.
What do you cite when you say that Christianity is actually harmful? What do you usually cite when you say that?
So there are 1,000 ways we could go with that, but We have an entire 45-minute presentation just on this. Think about the message that you put into the minds of children, right? You tell them that they're always being watched, that their thoughts themselves are sinful. You tell them that bad thoughts mean that they're evil. You tell them that they're broken. You tell them that they're evil.
You need a savior, you need a redeemer, you need a helper, you're weak, you're flawed, you're sinful.
You tell them that no relationship in their life with any other human being is more important than a relationship they have with somebody they can't see or hear. And if they don't see and hear, that something's wrong with them, and that their evil lack of faith is harming them somehow. You tell them that if they feel differently than other people about the gender that they're attracted to, or the things that they want to choose to do with their life, somehow they are wrong and evil and sinful.
Well, then it's even more sinister.
You create exclusivity. That, Christianity thinks that it treats everyone well, but it really creates in-groups and out-groups. And in the in-group, you're treated well, but if you're in the out-group, man, you're awful. You're evil, right? If you're a Muslim, you can't respect Islam. You can't respect people who are LGBT. You can't respect a Hindu. And that the things that those people believe are evil. It creates animosity. We can spend more time talking about it.
It has a profound effect on our democracy and public policy and long-term planning, because these people grow up and they become voters and they become our representatives, and they don't really believe we can fix this world's problems. They believe that Jesus has to come back to fix the problems.
And yet, there's this huge disconnect, because so many of you come to Texas here and love Jesus and all of this, but I've never been any place where people are so arrogant and so much of I take shit from nobody.
Exactly.
I mean, it's nothing like being up where I grew up in Wisconsin, where you have, Minnesota nice and stuff like that. People seem, for being made to feel ashamed of having doubts about all this religious doctrine, they have no doubts about all these other things.
Right.
Let me offer up a theory for you as to why Catholics don't have Bible study.
Because they don't care about the Bible?
They don't read the Bible.
Well, if you think about it, think all the way back to Galileo. What got Galileo in trouble? Not him stating that the earth is not the center of the universe, but in interpreting the Bible for himself. Right?
Exactly.
And in the Catholic Church, you have a very rigid rule hierarchy that says all your information about the Bible comes from the church, from the organization down.
Yeah.
So if you think about church history, for the first couple of centuries, the church was, meeting in houses, producing these documents, and very much a grassroots effort. When Constantine comes in and makes it the imperial religion, right, it became all about practice and ritual, and we're not even going to bother having the service in a language that most of the people can even understand. You just line up, you eat the cracker, you chant, and then you leave. You stand, you kneel. It was all about practice and ritual for well over 1,000 years. It wasn't really until the printing press and the Luther Reformation where religion started coming back to what we would recognize, which is about particular beliefs and particular interpretations of Holy Scriptures. That was never a part of Catholicism. So what we consider Roman Catholic is really the imperial version of Christianity.
Well, Catholicism was never really based on the Bible. In fact,
Right.
Isn't a quote from Paul? He says, Scripture is useful for teaching.
Right.
Even
Well,
Paul never
and even
said it's the entire basis of the religion.
sure, and when Paul would talk about Scripture, he certainly wasn't talking about the New Testament. He was
Right.
talking about the Old Testament, much of which he was ready to discard. Certainly, circumcision and Sabbath was no longer important to Paul.
When you consider that the way that America practices Christianity today, it's fascinating to think that as recently as 200 years ago, being a Christian was a completely different thing than it is today.
Well, this idea of having a relationship with Jesus, which is at the heart of half of this spectrum, is a very new concept. There's no historical precedent.
Right. The Protestant idea of sola scriptura, which is we set the liturgy and the church authority aside and we go back to the Bible. That's a relatively recent. That's an Enlightenment idea. We're going to
But it's also a silly idea because the 27 books we call the New Testament was decided by who?
Right.
The church, right? So the Protestants that want to reject the Catholic Church choose the book that was established by the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Well, I agree and maybe slightly disagree with that concept that it's relatively recent in the United States.
Sure.
But Gnosticism, and I believe fully that Paul was a Gnostic, believed that you know, you have unmediated access to God the Father and personal access.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, the Marcionite Codex actually was the letters of Paul and one of the Gospels, I don't remember which one. Right, so we have man, there's so much ground where we can talk about that. I agree, Paul, a lot of Gnostics used Paul's letters as justification for their Gnostic sort of understanding. If you have never read Ehrman's book on Lost Christianities, that's the title, Lost Christianities, I highly encourage you to read it. It talks about what Bruce is talking about here. There was so much diversity in the early Christian church that modern Christians never consider. They assume that the way their parents and grandparents taught them Christianity is the way Christianity's been since Jesus, and they are galactically wrong about that.
You know,
Richard Gary has written about, are you familiar with?
Absolutely.
Sure.
So mythos is number one.
Right.
Correct. But
I like your.
it's not just mythicism, saying Jesus never, it's also understanding why or where this whole business of Jesus came from, that Jesus was originally an archangel.
Sure.
It's all acting out in a mirror image instead of becoming, instead of being thrown down to hell for rebelling and trying to be like God, he submitted and did become God.
have you ever gone to a Sunday school class that knows anything about the past history of the Marcionites and the Ebonites and so on and so forth? And the Marcionites, of course, they believed in two gods, et cetera, et cetera.
On the liberal end, we will encounter people who have read and who have an understanding like that, but also have a very liberal understanding of what Christianity is. And when we go to the spectrum, the first two claims, miracles are real God and the Bible is divine, those almost kind of always go together. And then the next three, Christianity is the Christian plan of salvation is beautiful, the Christianity is good for the world, and life is meaningless without it. Those are 3, 4, and 5. So most of the most liberal Christians who have the knowledge that you're talking about really live in points 4 and 5, and that's why they go to church, and that's what, when you ask them, what keeps you coming if you don't really believe a lot of the literal miracle stuff? And the answer is habit, or I can't imagine life without some kind of meaning, right? But the more conservative you get on that scale, when you're in the Pentecostals and the Southern Baptists, they very rarely do we find that there's good scholarship certainly on early Christianity.
And one of the fascinating sort of parallels to that is how it lines up politically. Owen and I like to get there early and go check out the library, or some of us have a bookstore. The libraries are always interesting because we'll find sort of very fundamentalist apologetics books and the kind of places you would expect, and a shelf over, it's George Bush and Oliver North. It's very sort of the Fox News usual suspects. And then on the liberal end, it's exactly the opposite. You'll find, sort of very democratic, liberal political writers next to Ehrman and Spong and those kind of books. And so I don't know why it is, but it does tend to line up that way, that the more liberal believers also tend to flush their shelves with the more liberal political.
You can be in a room full of Christians, I love this point, you can be in a room full of Christians this size, right, who attend church weekly, and there is not one red state voter in that room.
Yeah.
It's in Texas, in Dallas, Texas. That's
and I've actually done, in a room about this size, show of hands, anyone that believes they're going to go to heaven or hell when they die. Not a hand. And we're talking people in Sunday school, so it happens.
I don't want to shut it down, I just want to say that since it is all getting to be noon, if anybody needs to leave, wants to leave, it's not rude, and it's perfectly fine.
It wouldn't be the first time people have walked out on us.
That's what I'm saying.
No, you're fine.
If you have other plans or something, that's perfectly fine, but do put all your cash into those rainbow boxes at the back of the room, because we still do need your support. Freethought is not free. Rex and Owen came and spoke without charging us, but we do pay the hotel and our other costs. I don't know how many of you know it, but I think we're maybe the only group in town that advertises in the 2 major newspapers. So on the Saturday before our services, our little ad always goes in there. It's just kind of a little flag to the believers and everybody else. We're here, and I think probably not a lot of people find their way to us, but it's advertising for us.
Thank you for doing it.
So we're doing together what none of us can do on our own. That's the idea of peaceable assembly. You can sit home and watch, in fact, you can watch these guys on YouTube at home, but you can't talk to them.
Yeah. You can email us,
Can't get their,
skepticaltexans.org.
which is a very, very good also, but kind of a narrow pipe. But do help us promote your values and demonstrate your commitment to be the future that you want to be. And do come back next month, and then all who want to stay, I think most of us do, to hear some more from Rex and Owen.
Any other questions?
The existence of the Palestinian refugee problem is an abomination.